Okay, now that I'm finally done talking about all this context, I can finally talk about the last Great War of Antiquity. Now, most videos, books, TV shows will start here as to what caused the fall of the Sassanid Empire, and it makes sense because this is during the Sassanid Empire at their zenith of power. And during this war, they will get to the largest territorial extent that they've ever been able to achieve, rivaling that of the Achaemenidians. So ultimately, this was a period where the Sassanid Empire was at its climax, and it's here that we will see its massive fall. Now, again, the reason why I wanted to explain the Sassanid-Parthian struggle is because without explaining and understanding that the Sassanids and the Parthians had one hand of the steering wheel of the giant truck that is the Sassanid Empire, you'll never understand why exactly the Sassanids fell apart so easily during the war, what happens later on with their conquest by the Arabs. And also, spoiler alert, but the war goes very well for them, and it's only towards the final events of the war in the final years that we see a massive reversal. Now, the war would begin from the Byzantine dynastic struggle. The Emperor Maurice was killed by Phocas, actually a rebelling centurion of the Byzantine army. When Maurice was killed, one of his children would attempt to flee to the Sassanid capital, and with the pretense of installing his son onto the throne, the Sassanids would wage war against the Byzantines. The Byzantines and the Sassanids have warred many times, so this was not an unusual thing, but the length of the war was definitely unusual, from 603 to about 630, and the amount of resources the Sassanids would ask of the Parthians would exhaust the empire to its breaking point, leading to Parthian frustration and empire-wide exhaustion for the Sassanids, and this would lead to lack of manpower, veterans, equipment, etc. Now, the war is broken up into three distinct phases. The first phase, 603 to about 609, will focus on the Sassanids advancing deep and capturing western Mesopotamia and the Caucasus, pushing into Armenia as a diversionary front. These forces were led by Shahin and Khosrow II. Now, from 610 to 621, we have the second phase. This is where the Persians strike deeper and deeper into northern Syria, going into Anatolia and reaching the Bosphorus in 615. Then simultaneously pushing into southern Syria, capturing Jerusalem in 614, later Egypt from the Byzantines. Now, specifically, the battles aren't important here. They deserve their own focus. However, it's towards the end of the second phase and the beginning of the third that we start to see a reversal of fortune for the Persians. Now, it's the end of the second phase where we have the Persians divided into three armies. We have the army of the east, the army of the south, led by Shahrvarez, and then we have the Persian army in the north, led by Farrokh. But he would also be taking orders from his dad, Farrokh Hormozd, who had a control over his dynastic family, right? He was the family leader. And now Shahrvarez was actually related to Vistam, so also keep that in the back of your mind as well. It's with these three armies the Persian forces were concentrated in, and Khosrow at this time was solely focused on the Byzantines, with Sanbat holding together the Sassanid Empire with as many rubber bands as he could muster. That this is where we're currently at in the current military structure. Shahin was currently in control of occupation forces in Alexandria and Nubia, which kind of nullifies him altogether. Now, Farrokh was in charge of pushing into Anatolia towards Constantinople, with Shahrvarez controlling Palestine, Syria, western Mesopotamia, and southern Anatolia. Farrokh Hormozd's family, along with Farrokh and Rostam, will come up later, but they're a Parthian dynastic family that's related to the Medes or Media dynastic line, so a completely different Parthian family that will now come up in much importance, of course. Now, with these individuals will actually revolt against Khosrow II, and we don't know exactly why. And in the books, I have read it changes with Shahrvarez seeking out Farrokh, then teaming out, or flipped for Farrokh seeking Shahrvarez. It's very possible that Khosrow II wanted to axe Farrokh or possibly Shahrvarez, more likely Shahrvarez, after the failures and the defeats that the Sassanids were facing during the third phase of the war, actually. So that would include even the famous siege of Constantinople, which, I mean, that never worked out because the Persians couldn't really even get their forces over to the other side. This could be the catalyst for why Khosrow wanted to kill one of his generals, were because of their failures. We have many more stories as well that detail different instances. There's also one narrative that states that Heraclius might have bribed one of the generals, which would actually be Heraclius and Shahrvarez, but I think more than likely these generals came on their own accords with Heraclius instead of Heraclius convincing them both. For example, in this one story, Khosrow II was annoyed at Shahrvarez for taking too long in Syria. After being frustrated with him, he then sends messages to Farrokh to kill Shahrvarez, but after refusing to kill him, Khosrow II would then ask Shahrvarez to kill Farrokh, and failing to kill this said man, he then is about to do it, and when Farrokh shows off the letters to Shahrvarez giving him orders to kill him, and after producing a second set of letters with more instructions, Shahrvarez pledges to kill Khosrow. And in Farrokh's story, it's exactly the same, and these two versions of the story highlight Khosrow asking his generals to kill each other because relations were breaking down between either one of them or both of them. It's very funny because instead of his objective to kill them, it was probably the worst case scenario that 2/3 of the army basically rebelled, and now this combined with Khosrow II treatment of Vistam and Vinduyi still fresh in the minds of people, it didn't really help out. We will explain the Persian army in the east later on, but just keep in mind the situation that's brewing. Now, both Farrokh and Shahrvarez would never outright rebel, they just never engaged Emperor Heraclius, really encouraging him and having a free hand in the Sassanid Empire. Now, Khosrow didn't know about this and ordered Farrokh and Shahrvarez to clamp down on both sides of the Heraclius' army, with Shahrvarez and Farrokh, and by extension Farrokh was not listening to his commands. There wasn't a lot for him to do and save himself, as Rostam, also Farrokh's brother, was also rebelling in the Sassanid Empire in a proper Irana Shah, so that doesn't help. And in some sources, Khosrow also asked the generals to cull their mutinous elements in their army, but when the order wasn't listened to, a lot of the nobles and high-member clergy panicked as what was to come. Now, Farrokh during this time would try and convince many of the religious elite and the nobility on what should be done and who should be the next Shah. Spoilers for this part in the anime, the next Sassanid king would be Shiryoyi Quebad, who was, funny enough, during the war imprisoned by his dad. Now, Shah sided with Shahrvarez during this whole endeavor, and Khosrow II had a falling out with Sambat Bagrutani's son. Most of the Parthian dynasty at this point did not like Khosrow II, first and foremost because the war was exhausting them to breaking point, and also because a lot of them were pissed off still at Vistam and Vinduyi and their killing. And in addition to this, Farrokh, as well as Farrokh cozying them up to the idea of rebellion didn't help as well. So Parthian families like the Kanarangians, who weren't part of the Pahlav faction, would ally with them in order to depose Khosrow II. Now, the army in the east, or the army of Nemruz, was secretly mutinous towards the Sassanids, and this would be an army under the control of the Surin family in Sistan's southern Iran, and because of their close proximity to the Sassanids in terms of bloodline and location, they saw themselves as different to the Pahlav faction in the north and created a new Parthian faction supportive of the Sassanid rule, calling themselves the Parsig. A big difference between the two factions, I think that'll make it easier for you guys to remember, is that the Parsig would make coins out with the face of the Sassanid king. The Pahlav would just make a face out of the Parthian dynasty in control of the Pahlav forces. Now, the Parsig faction would not help the king because of the murder of a Mardan Shah, who was earlier spot bed of the army of the east, and because of a prophecy foretelling an individual from the east challenging him, and because of his great prestige, there was no equal to him. So to prevent his paranoid delusions from coming true, he cuts off the Mardan Shah's hand, stopping him from challenging Khosrow. And Khosrow will regret this and try to make things right, but the Mardan Shah, after being humiliated, would ask to die, and he would be granted that wish, and that would be the primary reason why the Nemruz faction did not like Khosrow. Now, 622 to 628 is the final phase of the war, with Heraclius moving into Transcaucasia, then moving through Azerbaijan and Armenia, sacking Zoroastrian religious sites like Ganzak and Ardur Gushnat, and also, in addition to this, striking Parthian cities along Media, Azerbaijan, Armenia, etc. Now, regardless of the stories that I have told you guys, it would be Shahrvarez to initiate the mutiny, and Khosrow was no dummy. He knew a mutiny was coming, but he couldn't really do anything about it. He relied on Shahrvarez and Farrokh's army to win his war. Farrokh's bro, Rostam, would actually rebel before Heraclius would invade Persia in 624, so he couldn't axe Shahrvarez or Farrokh because they could indeed actually turn around, ally themselves with Rostam, and make the rebellion even more problematic for the Sassanid state. Keep in mind, he also didn't know that Farrokh had this six-dimensional chess-like plan where he was using Farrokh and Rostam to pretty much undermine and destroy Khosrow II. And when Heraclius does invade in 624, Farrokh just parks his army in Azerbaijan and just watches them go by. And Shahrvarez, he's ordered to recall back to defend against Heraclius, but he mutinies. This allows Heraclius to attack key Parthian and Sassanid cities as well as destroy holy Zoroastrian religious sites. So Persia, and to a lesser extent Khosrow, is at the mercy of these armies and Heraclius. And in 626 to 627 in the second invasion, then Farrokh as well as Shavarez would publicly mutiny. So from 624 to 627 you see 2 mutinies, 1 rebellion, and a giant invasion destroyed Sassanid Empire. And on February 628, Khosrow would be deposed and Pourshariati would come to the throne for the Sassanid surrender. The letter would be sent to Ganzak deep into Farrokh territorial control, so the Byzantines were just parking themselves right there waiting for the surrender of the Sassanids. Mir Hormozd, he would be the one to actually kill Khosrow, the son of the Mardan Shah. So it's amazing circle of life going on here, with Khosrow being happy since he still regretted killing Mir Hormozd's dad. And this would come from an order from Pourshariati after having his hand tied behind his back, forced by the manipulations of Farrokh Hormozd and the nobility in order to kill his dad so that they could promise their service to him, or they would rebel just like they did with his dad. So really fucked up stuff. But we finally get on and over with this chapter of messed up Sassanid history. Now, I know I haven't really focused too much on battles or formations or tactics or technology at all, but that's because ultimately in this war, none of those mattered. You can have all of those things, but if 2/3 of the army are going to rebel because you're pissing off the generals, then you can have all of those advantages and still lose. And this is basically what happened to the Sassanids. They were winning for the first 20 years of the war, and it was only during the last, I don't know, 10, maybe even 6 or 8 years of the war that they end up losing the war. And this was without a decisive military conflict. So let's review. Khosrow II is probably the biggest dummy ever because he just pushed things way too far. Khosrow II actually had an opportunity to end the war at about 614 to 615 when the Sassanids conquered Egypt and they reached the Chalcedon right in Anatolia, and they were just about to engage in their, more conquest, more campaigning, pushing through and maybe laying siege to Constantinople. They were just about to do that when Emperor Heraclius would try and negotiate with the Sassanids, maybe ceding off some territory, but ultimately his idea was that he would make the Byzantine Empire a client state of the Sassanid Empire and be considered a son instead of an equal to Khosrow II. But Khosrow rejected this negotiation, and he would continue the war. And he continued and continued and continued, and I honestly do not know why. But it's obvious that he got way too cocky, and he thought he could make the Achaemenidian Empire again. And damn well, he was close to doing it. And heck, if he just ceded off some territory and made the Byzantines a tributary state or a client state, then that would have accomplished that, goal, would it not? But no, he got way too cocky. And even the Sassanids at their most powerful, it doesn't matter how powerful they are if most of their army is controlled by Parthian dynasts and Khosrow II pisses off the Parthian dynasts because they just use those powerful armies against the Sassanids, which ended up happening. It's just funny because most sources and most books and movies, they don't talk about all these rebellions happening at the same time from 640, 646 to 627. 624 to 627, my bad. They don't talk about all these rebellions. They just say that the Byzantines and Sassanids lose, the Sassanids are so close to winning, but the Byzantines just kind of circumnavigate through the Black Sea, go through Armenia, and then just beat up the Sassanids, which does happen, but it doesn't happen because of the Byzantines. It happens because of the Parthian dynasts letting them just go to town, which is funny. It is ultimately funny that a victory that a lot of people attribute to the Byzantines is caused by the Parthians, and to an extension, the Parthian Empire. So it's just hilarious. And Khosrow II's cockiness really lost him the war ultimately. He could have had it all, but at least now he's having nothing 6 feet under. Actually, not 6 feet under, because Zoroastrians, they take bodies and they dump them in these towers of silence, and then afterwards crows and birds peck at the dead bodies until they're wiped clean. So yeah, he's not 6 feet under. Now, this concludes the second part of what destroyed the Sassanid Empire, and it's going to be into the third and final part that we'll talk about, the last chapter, the last thing that really destroys the Sassanid Empire. That would be the Islamic conquest of Iran, and I'll talk about the effects of the last great war of antiquity in that video. So subscribe to see that. See you guys soon. Bye bye.